Hello everybody, welcome to this morning's Speakers for Schools virtual talk. We're delighted you've been able to join us today. This session will last around 45 minutes in total and will include a presentation from our speaker before moving to student Q&A. Questions for today's speaking can be submitted via the Q&A function on the right hand side of your screen, and this will be open towards the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all submitted questions. There is simply not enough time to answer them all, but rest assured they have been received. We're very excited to welcome this morning's speaker, Ben Saunders. Ben is a polar explorer and record-breaking long-distance rower and has kindly agreed to join us today to talk about his career and adventures, focusing on the importance of goal setting, self-belief, resilience, teamwork, communications and leadership. Ben, hi, welcome to your first virtual Speakers for Schools talk. I know you've done in-person events for us for a while.
Thank you, Carly. Yes, this is my first, but I've done gosh, I've lost count, quite a few talks actually in schools, but this is my first virtual one from my office at home. So good morning.
Morning. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. So I think you have a fantastic presentation to get us started, and then we'll move into some of our wonderful student questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Carly. So good morning. Hopefully you can see the slide in the background. My name is Ben Saunders. As you've heard, I'm normally introduced as a polar explorer, which is a weird sounding job title, and it is definitely not a job that my careers advisor at school ever mentioned as an option. So trying to remember back to when I was at school, one of the things I hated trying to answer was that question, what do you want to do when you grow up? Because I had no idea, and I certainly didn't realize that doing anything like leading expeditions in the Arctic or Antarctica was even an option. So so my goal today is not to inspire you to start planning your own expedition to the Arctic or Antarctica or anything ridiculous like that, but just maybe to think a little bit differently about your own potential and what it is that you might want to do with your life. Because my story has been an unusual one, and I guess I'm in a very small group of grown-ups who have sort of ended up doing something that I kind of dreamt about when I was quite young, but everyone said was ridiculous and impossible, and it happened. So I hope there's something useful in this story for you all. I have been doing this for nearly 20 years now. So my first expedition was in 2001. I was 23 years old. It was to the North Pole. Now, the North Pole is a weird place because it's in the middle of the sea. If you spin a globe, the North and South poles, the very top and the bottom. So North Pole is at the top, obviously, and it's slap bang in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. So if you are daft enough to want to walk there, you're walking over the frozen surface of the sea. It is so cold at the very top and the bottom of the planet that the Arctic Ocean is mostly frozen, but it's getting warmer every year. The ice is getting thinner every year. So it's a journey that's getting harder and harder. So yeah, my first expedition was in 2001. Since then, I've led 12 big expeditions. I've skied solo to the North and South Poles. So I spent many weeks on my own, walking around on skis, living in a tent, dragging my sledge. And I hold the record for the longest ever polar journey on foot. And it's that journey that I'm going to talk to you about particularly today, because that was my biggest ever expedition. The trip that was, I guess, the hardest, the most challenging in many ways, but the one looking back that I'm most proud of. Now, it was down here. This is, hopefully most of you will recognize this. This is Antarctica. This is a wonderful composite satellite image. So basically lots of photographs stuck together, taken from satellites. And Antarctica is a really unusual place. Unlike the North Pole, the South Pole is slap bang in the middle of land. It's a really big bit of land. So Antarctica is a continent. It's about the same size as China and India put together. So it's a massive place. It's the coldest place on Earth. Ambient air temperatures in winter down there, when it's dark 24 hours a day in midwinter, sort of minus 80 degrees. I think minus 88 is the record. I'm not sure, but it's incredibly cold. It's the driest place on Earth. Antarctica has less precipitation. Obviously, it doesn't rain down there, but if you kind of imagine rain and snow being similar things, less precipitation than Africa. So it's a desert, technically. It is the windiest place on Earth. The highest ever wind speeds have been recorded in Antarctica, and it is the highest altitude continent on Earth. The there's a big plateau in the middle, big flat area in the middle of Antarctica with the South Pole in the center, and that averages more than 2,500 meters above sea level. So it's a land of extremes. And between October 2013 and February 2014, my teammate, who was called Taka, a great friend of mine, Taka and I very simply walked from the bottom of this red line on the coast of Antarctica, a place called Ross Island, to the South Pole, which is at the top of the red line, where we turned around and walked back to the coast again. This next map gives you some idea of scale. You can see the United States of America over the top, and there's Great Britain Island on the left. The total round trip was just over 1,800 miles, in fact, 1,801 miles exactly. So that's nearly 70 marathons back to back. Except we weren't just running marathons, we were traveling on skis, wearing harnesses, dragging sledges with all our food, all the equipment we thought we might need for nearly 4 months in the middle of nowhere. So we were dragging 200 kilos each. So basically that was the same, more or less, as dragging two fairly fat blokes, two sort of rugby players each in a bathtub on a bit of rope behind us for nearly 70 marathons in the coldest, windiest, driest, highest place on earth. So it's probably unsurprising this journey had never been done before, and it was best summed up, I reckon, by this magazine called Business Insider. Two explorers just completed a polar expedition that killed everyone the last time it was attempted. Now, my mum has never been that happy about these big expeditions, and the chances of us succeeding on this really big project didn't seem great at all. 9 people in history had ever attempted this. 5 of them had died in the process, and none of them had finished it. So you might have heard of the last person to have a go. His name was Captain Scott, Robert Falcon Scott, Scott of the Antarctic. Scott and Shackleton really are the 2 most famous British polar explorers in history. And this was just over 100 years ago. They were, both of them in separate teams, trying to become the first people to reach the South Pole. And these journeys, just over a century ago, had, I reckon, quite a lot in common with the idea of flying to Mars in the next 10 years or so, whatever it might be, because they were sailing away, Scott and his team, or Shackleton and his team, were sailing away from the UK, often for 3 years at a time, with no hope of being rescued if anything went wrong, no communication home, and no idea really what lay beyond the horizon. People knew Antarctica was massive, but no one knew what was in the middle. So these were really incredible expeditions. And Scott's last attempt was an expedition. They left the UK in 1910. It was called Terra Nova. It was a huge team of people using, they had ponies, you can see here, little horses, they had dogs, they had tractors, they had people dragging sledges, positioning this big supply chain of depots stretching out towards the South Pole. Scott's final team of 5 were traveling on foot. They arrived at the South Pole in January 1912 to find, to their horror, that they'd been beaten to it. Now it's black and white, so you can't tell, but on the far left of this photograph is a flag that was already flying at the South Pole. It's a Norwegian flag. Some of you might know the story. They were beaten by a few weeks by a Norwegian team led by a guy called Roald Amundsen. Amundsen had traveled way more quickly because he'd used dogs and dog sleds. Amundsen and a small team had been riding on the back of the sleds, cracking the whips. Pretty cruel. They started with 53 dogs and finished with 11. The dogs were dying en route. They were shooting dogs and feeding them to the other dogs. So Scott's team, meanwhile, were traveling on foot. They were dragging their own sledges far more slowly. Arrived at the pole, realized Amundsen had been there before them, and pretty disappointed, I reckon. You can kind of see their faces in this photograph. They're not happy men. They were pretty exhausted and starving hungry, very cold, frostbitten. Turned around, started walking 900 miles back to the coast, and none of them survived. All 5 of these men died in 1912, so more than 100 years ago. And they died, the last 3 to die, including Captain Scott. Scott is second from the left with goggles on top of his sort of balaclava. The last 3 to die had covered nearly 1,600 miles, which is a record that stood until 2014. When Tak and I finished our expedition. And to me, it seemed extraordinary that nobody had finished this journey. Most people had heard of Captain Scott, most people had heard of Shackleton, but very few people seemed to realize that the journey they died trying to make was still unfinished. So that's what Tarka and I set out to do. Now, some people said, Ben, why don't you do it properly and wear the same clothes and drag wooden sledges and eat the same food and don't take a satellite phone? And I didn't think about that for very long, partly because if you look at Scott or Shackleton or Amundsen, they were all using the best technology, the best clothing, the best equipment, the best knowledge they could get their hands on. So I was fine about making this a high-tech 21st century expedition. And in fact, using 21st century technology meant that Tarka and I could attempt this journey in a way that would have been impossible and unthinkable for Scott, which is two men on their own dragging everything. No dogs, no ponies, no support team, just two people dragging everything from the start. And we started from exactly the same place because Captain Scott's wooden hut is still standing on the shore of Ross Island on the very edge of Antarctica. I mean, you can see the hut in this photograph. We had about 20 minutes inside the hut. This is Captain Scott's bed. It's a weird place. It looks and feels like Captain Scott and his men left a few minutes ago. You can see Scott's got a spare sleeping bag made of reindeer skin. There's a pair of socks hanging up, notebooks and diaries and things. The table was still laid. There was a kettle on the cooker. So it sort of felt a bit haunted. And I had this incredible sort of rising wave of absolute fear, thinking, hang on a minute, this is the journey that defeated Shackleton, killed Captain Scott. They're the two biggest names, the two biggest heroes, two biggest icons in my world. No one's attempted this in a century. Why is that? What have they figured out about this that's impossible? And who the heck am I to be standing here in Captain Scott's hut thinking I'm the one that can pull this off? So I felt very small and very scared when we started this journey. And off we went. Now, if you've seen a documentary about Antarctica, and there are lots of wonderful ones, there was Dynasties recently about the emperor penguins. There's been March of the Penguins, Frozen Planet, Life in the Freezer, all these incredible films. I think you might imagine that Antarctica is full of penguins because that's what most of these films are about. The reality is very different. The only living things down there, the only penguins and birds and seals and things live around the coast, at the very edges where there's food coming from the sea. Once you get into the middle of this massive continent, the size of China and India put together, there's nothing living at all. It's a giant white desert. So no birds, no animals, no plants, no trees, nothing going on at all. So, and most of it is completely featureless. So we started our journey by walking across an area called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is about the same size as France. So we walked diagonally across France to start the journey, except unlike France, no hills, no valleys, no shops, no cafes, no people, nothing at all, flat white nothingness. So it got mentally as hard as it was physically because there's nothing going on. We'd walk for 9 or 10 hours a day. We'd finish somewhere that looked exactly the same as where we started from. And that's when the weather's good. When the weather gets bad and you get cloud and mist and things, you can't see a thing. And we had lots and lots of days of what's called whiteout, where you can't see anything at all. You can't even see the horizon. The sky and the snow look the same. So some really tough conditions. And one of the weirdest things was that Tarka and I spent 3.5 months in the biggest wilderness on Earth. We didn't see any other people until we got to the South Pole, where we turned around, and we were only there for a few minutes. So the rest of the time, it was just two of us, no one else around. And yet we were living in this tiny space. That's our tent. You can see in this photograph. The kind of space that it would be illegal to keep prisoners in for 3.5 months, 108 nights. And some of you in lockdown might have found it difficult kind of being stuck at home with your family, confined to a small space. Well, Tarka and I had some challenges as well. This was the inside of our tent. If I tell you that we didn't wash for 108 days, we had no hot water, no soap, no shower gel, anything like that. And if I tell you we changed our underwear 3 times in 3.5 months, you can imagine when I say that we learned a few things about kind of getting on as human beings and sort of teamwork and communication. Tark and I were good friends when we started. We're still good friends now. That's one of the things I'm most proud about. But we had to learn a lot about the way we communicated, and we realized that when it came to our equipment, like our tent or our clothing, if something wasn't quite right, if a bit of clothing had a little rip in it, or a loose thread, or if the tent had something, if the zip was slightly broken, if we ignored it and hoped that it would sort of sort itself out, in these sorts of conditions, really, really harsh conditions, small things become big issues very quickly indeed. And the same thing was true of our relationship and our friendship and the way we got on as two people in this little team. If something wasn't quite right between us, we had to talk about it and figure it out and fix it straight away, because we knew, just like a little rip in the clothing or a loose thread, the same was true of our relationship. If there was some small thing grating and not working, if we didn't deal with it, we would fall out and end up having a fight pretty quickly. So it was difficult, but we got on really well. We were a pretty high-tech trip. I'm a big geek deep down, and Intel, the technology company, one of the sponsors, so we had some really cool, this is back in 2013, so this was like the smallest laptop you could get at the time. This was connected to a satellite phone. We had solar panels over the roof of the tent, because when we were down there, it was 24-hour daylight. We were there in the summer. Summer's a misleading term. It was still -40 on very cold days, but it never got dark. So we were able to sort of update our website and share the story of what we're doing every single day. And our journey took us, once we crossed the Ross Ice Shelf, up one of the largest glaciers on Earth. A glacier is really just a massive bit of ice, and normally it's coming down a valley very slowly, a bit like sort of icing on a cake, slowly sliding off. You imagine Antarctica is covered in ice, and it's very, very slowly sliding off over centuries towards the sea. So Shackleton discovered the Beardmore Glacier. It's one of the largest valley glaciers on Earth. Very few people have been there. It turns out that Tarka and I are the only living people who walked up the Beardmore Glacier, and then when we turned around the South Pole, to walk back down it again. It was a really magical place. This is Tarka clutching a little piece of map, and we've cut the map up to make it lighter, trying to find the best route. The surface was very different. You see there's no snow. It's this shining, almost looks polished. It's polished by the wind, but it's solid ice called blue ice. So our skis didn't work very well. We had to use crampons, which are these sort of spikes on our boots to climb up the glacier. And when we got to the top, we popped out on the Antarctic Plateau, which is a bit like the Ross Ice Shelf, not much going at all. It's flat and white and featureless, except it's high altitude, so between 2,500 and 3,000 meters above sea level, which is hard enough to make life even more difficult. 3 weeks later, we finally arrived at the South Pole. Now, Captain Scott wrote in his diary of the South Pole, "Great God, this is an awful place." Now, I don't know why we didn't pay more attention to that, but our feelings were pretty similar. It was a strange anticlimax, partly because it almost feels nowadays like a small town. There are all sorts of buildings there. There's a big American scientific base. There's noise. You can hear vehicles driving around and lots of work being done. So it's a sort of noisy, busy, dirty place. And we had to find a way through all these buildings before we finally found the South Pole. There's the pole. Took a photograph. We didn't want to hang around there for very long because it was quite a tempting place to stop. So we just thought we'll take some photographs, turn around. You can see hanging around my neck is my compass. That's how we'd navigate a lot of the time. Took the photograph, turned around, and started walking back to the coast again. Things got really miserable after that. I thought that would be the easiest bit of the trip, but the weather was really bad. It was really cold, really windy, really poor visibility. And by that stage, we were pretty hungry. This is Tarka looking very skinny in the tent. It's a special occasion because he's changing his underwear. Obviously, it didn't happen very often. But you can see he's lost a lot of weight. I was in a similar condition. We both fattened up before the expedition because we knew we'd lose weight out there. It was just physically so tough. So I put on 10 kilos before the expedition, and I lost 22. I think Tarka lost 25 kilos. So physically and mentally, we were really, really pushing ourselves as hard as we could. This is heading back down the Beardmore Glacier. That's Tarka stopping to tighten up his boots, I think, or his crampons. And one of the hardest things to do about Antarctica is to put it into words, to explain what it's really like. And it is a massive, massive place. You can see this sort of gap on the horizon, the mouth of the glacier that we're aiming for. I think that's more than 10 miles wide. So you can fit some big cities in that gap on the horizon. It's just an enormous place. And then when we finally got to the bottom of the glacier, we found this was one of the scariest days of the whole 3.5 months, because we found these big crevasses. These are cracks, deep cracks in the glacial ice that we'd been able to steer around, navigate around on the way up. We found they'd been covered in fresh snow. And what happens is, if there's enough snow and enough wind, you get something called a snow bridge. I think there's a snow bridge from the side. So basically the wind sort of forms a bit of a lip on the edge, and if there's enough snow, the little lip finally gets carried across this big chasm until it meets the other side. So if I go back one, you can just see these on that's me on my left in this photograph. You see the sort of sagging little dips, almost like ditches or trenches on my left. They are snow bridges. So we had to cross loads of those before we finally made it safely over the last bridge, back onto the Ross Ice Shelf. All we had to do to finish was walk diagonally across a bit of ice the same size as France. Now, we knew that Captain Scott and his men had died 100 and something years before us, quite close to the mountains. So we knew that beyond that, we were in uncharted territory. No one had ever walked that far before. And I was secretly hoping that spending this much time in this big blank white nothingness might mean that Tarka and I became like two sort of superhuman monks. We might have all this time to sort of think and meditate and reflect and really wrestle with some of the big questions, like what's the meaning of life? Now, I'm sad to report that that didn't really happen. And in fact, we were so knackered and so hungry. The only thing I can remember thinking about for the last 2 weeks of this journey was cheeseburgers. I just had really vivid daydreams every single day of going. And I knew we'd be, once we left Antarctica, landing in a little town in South America in Chile called Punta Arenas. And I knew that in Punta there was a restaurant called Lomitos. It was like a big, cheap sort of burger restaurant. So I was so excited about cheeseburgers. So that's all I can remember thinking about for the last 2 weeks. So maybe that is the meaning of life, cheeseburgers, who knows? And then finally, 108 days after we started, we made it back to this pretty unglamorous looking finish line. The people in black and orange, all from New Zealand, they're all scientists. They have a base just along the coastline here. And you can just see in front of the sledges, there's a little crack between the ice and this rocky shore of Ross Island. That would have been the finish line for Captain Scott if he'd survived. That was the finish line for Shackleton when he turned around on his Nimrod expedition just short of the South Pole. And this was definitely the finish line for us. Now, I'd always imagined this was going to be the happiest moment of my life, that Tarka and I'd be jumping up and down, high-fiving, hugging, back-slapping, in tears. And actually, we were so tired. All I can remember is a sort of feeling of relief that we didn't have to drag our sledges any further. Now, this is rewinding a bit. This is a place called the Gateway. This is the entrance to the Beardmore Glacier. And I've put this photo in to remind myself that this journey and all of the 12 expeditions I've done haven't just been about suffering and struggle and difficulty. There have been some really magical moments as well. And this place was really, really special. It was discovered by Shackleton. Very, very few human beings have ever been there. Tarka and I, as I said, the only living people to have walked up this big snow slope and then walked back down it a few weeks later. And I'd read about this place in a book when I was a kid. So it felt like I was so lucky. I'd been beamed into the pages of a storybook that had inspired me since I was very, very young. Now, people often ask me, what kept you going when things were really tough? And if I'm honest, the biggest obstacles we had to overcome were never physical or environmental. It was never the temperature or the wind or the difficulty of the journey. It was always something in my own head. It was always my own fear or my own self-doubt or my own lack of confidence. And looking back, I think the biggest ingredient in the success that I've had in my very weird career has come from self-belief, the ability to believe in myself, even when everyone else is doubting me. And my theory is that self-belief is a bit like a muscle. It's a bit like physical fitness, like strength or endurance. The more you test it and stretch it and challenge it, the stronger it gets. The more time you spend outside your comfort zone, the stronger it gets. So that was a big lesson for me, and I will happily talk more about that in the questions, but I'm running out of time. So I think there's one more slide. That is about it. I want to leave you with one final thought. It's a dangerous thought because there might be some teachers listening, but I had, for many years, we had a little office in London and a small team of people helping me out, trying to get this big expedition off the ground. And I had a desk in the corner of the room. Framed above the desk was one of my school reports from when I think I was 13 or 14 years old. And there was one line that I liked. It said, "Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile." Now, I think that was actually my French teacher talking about my ability in French. But if I have learned anything in nearly 20 years of doing what I do, it is that no one else is the authority on your potential. And in my experience, with enough determination, enough self-belief, pretty much anything is possible, despite what anyone else said. So that's my story. Thank you all very much. And hopefully we've got some questions.
We do indeed, Ben. Thank you so much for that.
I'm going to stop sharing that. There we go. So you can see me, hopefully.
Yes, indeed. Perfect. We've had a lot of questions submitted from our students. Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. So just to get us started, I guess, Caitlin has asked, what was your inspiration to start doing polar expeditions? Oh,
very, very good question. Most of my childhood was in Devon and Somerset, so in the countryside, and I loved being outside when I was younger. I was in the Scouts. I wasn't a very good pupil at school. I think I was a big daydreamer, and you can guess what I used to daydream about. I used to love reading about and learning about explorers and adventurers and mountaineers. So I think even from a really young age, I was fascinated by these sorts of journeys and expeditions. And I think deep down, I always had a dream that I could maybe do one of these trips once. I never ever imagined I'd end up doing 12 over nearly 20 years, but I wanted to go to one of these places once. That was always a dream. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you so much. One of our students here, Holly, has asked, during your tough times and challenges, what was the main thing or people that made you keep going?
Oh, good question. I talked about this big expedition with Tarka that started in 2013, finished in 2014. We were a really, really good team, and we were good friends. We'd known each other for 10 years before we started, and we really had a lot of trust and a lot of faith in each other, and we definitely sort of pulled each other through some really tough times on that trip. And I've always found on these expeditions that I can't remember a single day that has been kind of okay or not too bad. It's either amazing or it's terrible. And often it's both in the same day. Sometimes it's both things in the same hours. You know, there might be some beautiful bit of scenery, or, you know, I might think to myself, God, I'm so lucky to be here. And then the next minute I might be really, really scared about falling into a crevasse. So I found that emotionally, I had these really big highs and lows between being really happy and loving it and being really scared and hating it. And I found that with Tarka, those sort of moods seemed to happen at different times. So when I was scared, he was able to help me. And when he was scared or struggling, I was able to help him. So we were a really good team. And then beyond that, we had a much bigger, almost like astronauts would have a sort of mission control. So we had people back in England who were looking at particularly looking at sort of weather forecasts and data and satellite images, and trying to help us out. So we'd speak to that team every evening just for a few minutes on the satellite phone. So that helped enormously as well. And beyond that, we had a lot of people following the journey. We had this website, and we had a lot of schools. I think nearly 400 schools around the world were sort of following the expedition, and they could send us questions, and we could try and answer them the next day on the website. So that actually was really helped with my motivation, the knowledge that there were lots of people following what we were doing, and that it might be inspiring them in some way.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. What a great way to engage with people whilst you're doing that as well. Quite a few of our students have submitted questions around food and what it is that you will have eaten on your expeditions, Ben. So May's asked, what foods did you eat? Bradley's interested in knowing, how did you plan how much food you would take, and how did you manage food and rationing while you were out there?
Yeah, food was one of the biggest things. Ultimately, this was, I always say to people, I'm not really an explorer in the old-fashioned Edwardian sense of the word. Like, everyone knows where the South Pole is nowadays, so we're not trying to discover the South Pole for the first time. What we were trying to do was to walk further than anyone had ever walked in history, in a really tough climate. So in a way, we were more like athletes than explorers, and how we trained, how we prepared, and then how we fueled ourselves and fed ourselves on the journey was crucially important. So we spent months, probably 18 months, a year and a half, kind of preparing for this expedition. And a big part of that was the nutrition, and trying to work out really scientifically how many calories a day we could take with us, what the best sort of food to take was, how we could try and look after ourselves physically. Now, we had the biggest challenge was that we were dragging everything behind us, so the food had to be as light as possible, and this meant it was all dry. The food was all freeze dried, so everything we had, the breakfast and dinner were sort of in a bag. So you'd basically tear the top off the bag and have all these dry ingredients, a bit like a pot noodle, but a bit more high tech than that. And then we would get water by melting snow in our tent. So we had a little stove, a little cooker. So every morning, every evening, we'd start melting snow in the sort of porch of the tent. The end of the tent was our little kitchen. And we'd get hot water from the stove, you'd pour it into the bag, and then eat the meal out of the bag. So yeah, breakfast and dinner were sort of in a bag. And breakfast was a bit like a sort of porridgey sort of mixture with a few other things in it to give it lots of calories. And then dinner was quite nice. We had, I think, 6 or 7 different meals. So that was our one bit of variety, and they were, you know, chicken curry and beef stew and that kind of thing. They were all made specially for us. And then during the day, we didn't really have lunch, but we'd stop every hour and a half and have some snacks and some hot drink. So again, we'd make the hot drink in the morning before we started. We'd fill up these 2 big flasks, and then we'd have a little bit of drink every hour and a half, and some food. And we had mostly these big energy bars that were made specially for us, and they had lots of fat in, because fat has more calories per gram than anything else. So fat has 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrate and protein have 4 calories per gram. So we're eating quite a high fat diet to get as much energy as we could. So these bars were, I'm trying to think what they're similar to. Maybe you might have seen, there are things called naked bars. Those they're made like fruits and nuts. It was like a really big one of those, except it had even more fat in it. So if I had one now in my hand, it would look really greasy and disgusting and oily. But actually, if it was -20 or -40, it would be really easy to eat. Whereas if I had like a Snickers bar or something, which would be easy to eat now, at -40, it would be rock hard and solid. So we had to think carefully about making the food edible as well as making it nutritionally correct. So we were eating 6,000 calories a day, which is a lot. I mean, that's 2 or 3 times as much as I'm eating normally at home now. So it's a lot of food, and we still lost weight because we were burning so many calories. But 6,000 calories a day was about as much as we could pull behind us. If we had even more food, then the sledges would be so heavy that we couldn't move. So it was always going to be a sort of compromise.
Absolutely. And a few of our students have asked about your kind of relationship and friendship with Taka as well. So Beth was interested in, did you ever get tired of each other? Do you have advice for finding someone that you can work really well with, even in terms of working as a team? There's a lot of interest in that kind of relationship and dynamic from students.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I met Taka about 10 years before that expedition, and he got in touch with me. I think he emailed me asking for some advice. He was planning a trip in the Arctic, and he had some quite specific questions. He said, look, I'm planning this trip and I've got these maps, and I'd love to come and ask your advice about a route. And he said, I know you're in London. Could I come and, I don't live in London now, but I was at the time. He said, could we come and have a cup of coffee, and could I pick your brains for half an hour? So I said, sure. What I didn't realize was that he was a student down in Bath at the time, and he cycled from Bath to London, which I don't know how long that took, 7 hours, 8 hours, I don't know, just extraordinary, just to meet me. And then he cycled home again. So I remember thinking, this guy, something a bit wrong in their head, like he's a total lunatic. Perfect. Like I'll remember his name, and we became really good friends. And he did some huge trips before he and I went to Antarctica. He walked with his girlfriend at the time. They walked the entire length of the Great Wall of China, which I think is like 7,000 kilometers or 6,000 or 7,000. It's huge. And very little of it apparently looks like the walls you see on the sort of postcards. And lots of it has almost disappeared. And there was some really, really cold areas, some really, really hot desert areas. He'd done that. He'd cycled all the way down through Africa. He'd done some amazing expeditions. So he had a lot of experience that was really useful. And then during the trip itself, I think the most important thing we learned, and it was also the hardest thing really, was being honest with each other and being able to say if we were struggling or finding it difficult, or if we needed some help from the other person, or if the other person was doing something annoying that was winding us up, or somehow kind of holding our performance back. So we had to be pretty frank and pretty straight and pretty honest with each other, and that was hard to do sometimes, but it worked really well.
Fantastic, thank you. I think a lot of our students might be thinking about how they work with teammates and kind of their fellow students when they're back in school next academic year. Quite a difficult question, actually, I think. One of our students here has asked, can you sum up your expedition to the South Pole in one word?
Oof, wow. That's really difficult. I would say epic. In the genuine sense of the word. It was completely mind-blowing. It was the craziest thing, the most amazing thing, most difficult thing I've ever done. So epic.
Excellent, that's a fantastic choice in word. Quite a few of our students have asked questions around how it felt once you'd finished your expedition and returned home. Did you feel proud? Were you exhausted? What was the feeling there? Yeah,
this is really interesting. I mean, I could do a whole talk about this because for years and years and years, this was my biggest dream. This was the most ambitious goal I'd ever set myself. And I always thought, therefore, that if and when I finally achieved it, everything would be awesome. Like I would have made it, I would have succeeded, and my life would be incredible. And actually, what happened was, for years and years, I had this goal and this dream and this vision that was really motivating and was giving me all this energy and determination. And we had lots of failures. We had, I think, 3 or 4 years in a row where we weren't quite ready because we had this definite window to do with the seasons. And if we weren't ready, we had to postpone by another year. So we had all this frustration, all these setbacks, like trying to make it happen. And each time we failed to start, I just became more and more motivated. Like I had more and more determination and energy. And yet when we succeeded, when we finally finished this expedition, this goal and this dream that had been giving me all this energy, completely vanished, and there was nothing there to replace it. And when I thought my life was going to be awesome, actually it felt a bit empty, and I was physically really tired. Like it took a few months to recover completely and to feel sort of well and fit and healthy again, because I'd lost all this weight and we came back so tired and physically completely burnt out. But yeah, mentally, I sort of, this goal that had meant so much to me had sort of vanished. And I think maybe I'd made the mistake of thinking that success, this idea of being successful, was sort of getting to a finish line at some point in the future. And now I think very differently about success. I think success is like how you do things every day and how you live your life every day, rather than where you get to at some point in the future. And it's a big cliche that the journey is the important part and not the destination. But it took me this very long expedition to sort of figure that one out for myself.
Fantastic, and what a wonderful thing to be able to reflect back on and then share with our students today as well, who will be thinking about their future careers and successes and how they think about that as well. One of our students has asked, how did it feel when your eyebrows, eyelashes and beard were covered in ice?
Yeah, that selfie that was taken at the North Pole years ago, 2004. The North Pole, the one way that it's very different to Antarctica is humidity, so the amount of moisture that's in the air. Antarctica, as I said, is a desert, so it's really dry. The Arctic Ocean, North Pole, is you're walking over the ocean, over the sea, so it's really humid. So that's why you get all this ice and frost, and it's pretty miserable, to be honest. One of the weirdest things I remember is if you get enough ice on your eyelashes, when you blink, you can almost hear it. It kind of rattles. You get this really odd noise. So it's a very weird experience. It's not quite as miserable as it looks because you're wearing a mask and you've got this big hood. Everything's covered up. It's like being an astronaut. And on cold days in Antarctica, we had goggles as well. I didn't, obviously that first photo which I didn't have goggles because I think they were all full of ice as well. I couldn't see anything. But Antarctica, we were like astronauts. We had goggles and a face mask, and none of our skin was exposed, so completely covered up.
Fantastic, thank you. And a few of our students have asked, how did you raise sponsorship or funds for your expeditions? Is that something that's a big part of the whole process? Is it quite difficult to do?
It's a huge part, and it's one of the hardest parts because I didn't have any money when I started, and these trips are really expensive. So I had to find lots and lots of money to make them happen. And I'd always seen, even when I was at school quite young, I used to love reading about expeditions and seeing them on the news and the papers, and I always saw people that had like these big badges all over their jackets with logos of sponsors. So when I first started trying to find sponsors when I was like 20, 21 years old, my entire pitch was around trying to sell people like a badge on my clothes. The first ever meeting I had with someone interested in sponsoring me, I was explaining that I was trying to get to the North Pole. We were going to be two of us on this expedition. We were going to be in the middle of nowhere, like 5.4 million square miles of Arctic Ocean, no one else around for 2 months. And he said, who on earth is going to see my logo when you're in the middle of nowhere? Like, what's the point in that? So I had to like go back to the drawing board. So it's been really, really hard work. And I mentioned this idea of sort of seeing myself as a weird kind of athlete. And you'll see footballers with sponsor logos on their team kit. You'll see, runners and triathletes and cyclists. They've all got sponsor logos. So the money came from companies and businesses that liked something about what I was doing. But it was really, really hard work, and it's still hard work now. It's in a way like getting to drag a sledge for hundreds or thousands of miles with frozen eyebrows. Like, that's the reward for doing the really difficult bit and raising all the money.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have time for one more question. And a lot of students have asked about what your kind of favourite moment during your expeditions has been. Is there one favourite moment, or is it a series, I guess, of amazing events?
Yeah, it's really hard to pick a favourite moment. I think I showed that photograph of walking up that long slope called the Gateway onto the Beardmore Glacier. And that was a really special moment because I'd read about this place in a book when I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And suddenly we were there ourselves. And we'd also found it, like we'd walked across this huge bit of ice, the same size as France. And our navigation was good enough that we'd made it to this little gap through the mountains. So that day was even though I was quite scared about walking up this giant glacier afterwards, that day was really special. And the weather was quite good. The sun was shining and it was just beautiful. So I felt really, really lucky to be down there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. A huge apologies to the students whose questions we didn't get the chance to get to, but we will share them all with Ben, so he has a chance to see what it is that you were asking and what was the kind of forefront of your minds this morning. Ben, thank you so much for being with us today. It really is appreciated.
Real pleasure. Thank you all.
Our students are going to really walk away with more insights into what it is to be an explorer, which is so exciting, but also I think reflecting on the idea of resilience and teamwork and strong communication as well, all of which is so helpful for our students in preparing for their futures as well. So really a huge thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Excellent. And just a quick note for students, we have shared a feedback form in the Q&A thread. It'd be wonderful if you could complete that. And we've also shared the colour for today's activity sheet that is light red. And don't forget, you only need to complete that if your school or college or teacher have asked you to do so. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.